Okay, kicking off the next to last lecture series here for this course, talking about the 1970s with Richard Nixon as president, as well as Gerald R. Ford and Jimmy Carter, who round out the decade. But nonetheless, if you remember back to the last lecture series or a couple before that, Richard Nixon got elected in 1968 thanks to a fracture of the Democratic Party in wake of Lyndon Johnson not running again and Robert F. Kennedy's assassination. Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic nominee in 1968, wound up having a very chaotic Democratic convention that was displayed on national TV, made the Republicans look more organized and experienced. So Richard Nixon was able to win that election. Now, this is going to represent a dramatic shift in terms of different policies the United States is going to have during this decade that's coming up with Richard Nixon, because Nixon is very conservative, especially compared to the very liberal Johnson. And Nixon's also what we call the last of the New Deal presidents. He does have a lot of programs that will help some of those New Deal programs as well as expand them, but he's also going to seek to roll back government intervention in certain things. So, nonetheless, let's go on to Nixon as president. Whenever he takes office on January the 20th, 1969, he is going to have a country that's in a lot of turmoil because of the Vietnam War with President Johnson and the handling of that, as well as the fact that the Warren Court and Congress had made a lot of laws in the 1960s that dramatically altered the American landscape. You had more civil rights granted to individuals throughout the nation that not everybody agreed with. You also had multiple instances of government intervention in programs such as Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start that required a lot of government spending. The budget deficit is going to rise tremendously under Johnson and throughout the 1960s, and there's going to be a huge debate over Medicare and Medicaid spending each election issue, or that issue is going to come up every election cycle pretty much from then on. It's still an issue in the election cycles to this day. So Nixon's going to ride a wave of what we call conservatism. This is a clinging to traditional values and standing up to changes in the United States, trying to make things back to the way they were in the past that worked, as well as there's a lot, or now it's tied to a lot of values that we had in the 1950s, less government intervention, and there's also a little bit of evangelical Christian aspects tied into this today. But back then, this is more of just clinging to traditional values. Republicans are going to gain popularity among conservatives. Remember, Republicans at the beginning of the 20th century, they were the Progressive Party. Now they are viewed as the Conservative Party. They also, like I've mentioned this multiple times, so maybe this will stick, but they want less government intervention. That's the big thing. Smaller national government, larger state governments. Okay, Nixon is going to win in 1968. He is going to promise a new type of federalism, which is an attempt to distribute power from the federal government back to state governments. Okay, this is still an issue every time that there is a Republican or conservative as president. They want to see the national government's intervention in certain programs shrink and turn that power over to the states. Okay, mentioned Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was basically one of our first conservative presidents in terms of the new conservatives who took offshore oil drilling and turned that over to the states of Texas and Louisiana from the national government, and also privatized the REA as well as the TVA, so that way the government was not intervening in businesses such as those anymore. Okay, now, he is also going to, with Nixon, he is going to promise something called revenue sharing. That is where local governments are going to get money from the federal government. They can spend it however they wish. Basically, beforehand, the local governments were relying upon their own revenue from taxes, various things that they would have, property taxes, things of that sort. But now the federal government is actually going to have a budget to give to the local governments, and they will spend it however they wish, instead of the federal government saying, here's how you have to spend this money. Okay, so that in itself is a very conservative idea, in which you want to eventually have less and less government intervention in those things, but nonetheless, this is what Richard Nixon started. He also said that he could impound funds, and if he felt that there was a program, abortion was a big issue at this point in time, if there was a program he did not agree with, such as those, in various clinics throughout states, he could withhold funds if they had been earmarked to go to controversial programs or programs he did not support. So the Supreme Court ruled that was unconstitutional, that if the state gets that federal money and they earmark it however they want, the president can't come in and say, I am vetoing how you're spending your money and I'm taking this away from you. Now, that abortion one was an extreme case. There are various other things that he may have stepped in and said, no, you're not going to spend that money, but nonetheless, it was ruled unconstitutional, and the practice of allowing the states to spend the money however they wish was allowed to continue without the president stepping in. Okay, now, he also promised something called law and order politics. This is another conservative aspect, feeling that there's too much crime and too many people that are going out trying to disrupt society. Okay, so with the law and order politics under Nixon, he's promised to go over and get the protesters and left-wing individuals that are disrupting Washington, D.C., as well as the war in Vietnam. He is going to order wiretaps of several individuals within the Democratic Party to see what their next tactics are, trying to prevent these protests from breaking out. And he's going to order reports from the CIA on thousands of the most influential anti-war protesters, those within the counterculture movement, who were also seeking to disrupt the war in Vietnam, and he's going to want to find dirt on them and then have that pushed in front of them so that way it will silence them. Okay, he is going to use this information to build a personal list of enemies of people he once harassed or arrested or silenced. He's also going to use tax return audits of the same individuals. Okay, these are all political tactics that are used today. Again, Nixon is the first one to do this. Now, let me back up here just for a second. The wiretapping thing, turns out that might be a little bit illegal, so that no longer is something that is utilized as heavily as Nixon did it. But the FBI, the CIA, they still can build case files on individuals, so that way they can see exactly what these individuals are up to and possibly plot against their next tactics. Now, Nixon's also going to embrace the fact that the South is angry with Democrats over the civil rights issues. Okay, Nixon is going to go to the South, and he is going to say, hey, the Democratic Party that you have voted for since before the Civil War, they've essentially abandoned you. I hear your voices, and I hear that you're frustrated with certain things, so I'm going to step in and kind of disrupt what the liberals are doing within the United States, and we'll see if we can just hold off on some of these things, such as desegregation and such as the flow of states' rights up to the national government. And he basically makes the South mad at liberals, and he is going to have a Southern strategy that helps bring in those votes for the Republican Party. However, he did not win the South in the election in 1968. That went to a guy named George Wallace of Alabama, who ran on a segregationist platform. And he picked up the four deep South states of Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Georgia. Okay, so nonetheless, Nixon's going to win those states and some in the next election in 1972. Nixon, as I mentioned before, with his Southern strategy, part of this was the slowing of integration. He did believe in integration of society, but he also realized that it was going too fast, or he felt it was going too fast, because there were a lot of protests that took place in places such as, if you ever watched the movie Remember the Titans, that took place in 1971. You saw a huge amount of fights as that school tried to integrate. But Nixon nonetheless understands that many people in the South are frustrated with how fast this is going, and he wants to limit those protests. So he slowed down school desegregation in Mississippi in particular and in South Carolina. Those two states, of course, what we consider some of the traditional Confederate states, and this is going to get him sued by the NAACP. And Nixon, as a matter of fact, after he gets sued, he's going to be found in violation of Brown versus Board, in which separate but equal, of course, is ruled unconstitutional. These efforts were overturned by the Supreme Court, but nonetheless, it did provide a little bit of disruption that Nixon had wanted. Okay, so moving on from there, Nixon on the Supreme Court. Even though the Supreme Court rules against him on this case, throughout the course of his first term, he is going to have 4 justices that either retire or pass away in office, so he is going to get to appoint 4 new justices during his first term. This is going to shift the court to a very conservative view. The last of Nixon's justices that served on the Supreme Court was Chief Justice William Rehnquist, who served all the way up to President Bush, who took office in 2001. Okay, the second President Bush that took office in 2001. So again, this all took place from 1969 this court was in place basically a little bit after 1969 to the early 2000s. He also, moving on from there, and I apologize just from hitting bullet point for bullet point on here, but for the sake of brevity, I want to make sure that we're getting everything in. But Nixon also is going to experience a stale economy, or a stagnant economy, I should say. This stagnant economy was going to be nicknamed stagflation. The economy is going to face high inflation after the 1960s. in which the money that we had is not going to be worth as much as it once was, so it costs more money to buy the same things that it once did. We're experiencing that here in 2022 as I read this with various things, including houses, used cars, and gasoline. But nonetheless, back then it happened during the 1970s as well. And he's also going to have a high unemployment rate during Nixon's first term. So you can see in this little chart right here, the gross domestic product, the amount of stuff that we exported to other nations, that went down. Because of this, unemployment's going to go up. Demand is going to go down as people don't have enough money to spend on these goods, and inflation is going to skyrocket. Nixon is going to make a couple of attempts to curb stagflation. So what's going to wind up happening, one of our, not necessarily allies, but a nation we had supported throughout the course of the 1940s all the way up to Nixon's first term in office, Israel, is going to get into a war with Egypt and Syria. We are going to support Israel through this war, and we are going to see the essentially other Middle Eastern countries get angry at us for supporting Israel in this. So OPEC, or the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, is going to raise oil prices as a response to the United States actually helping this out. Now, we do have American oil companies at this point in time that we are not relying upon as much. We are getting most of our oil from the Middle East. Companies such as Gulf and Texaco, those were largely pushed out in favor of these Middle Eastern countries. But once we start having this practice and actually start utilizing OPEC for most of our oil, this is going to raise oil prices as they are going to raise these oil prices, and it's going to quadruple the price of oil in the United States. People that own the gas stations were not able to obtain as much gasoline as they once had because of the amount of price. There was also a gas shortage because they cut off the amount of oil they exported to us. And so anyway, this is going to lead to a lot of gas shortages. You can see the individual owning the gas station over here on the right telling people that, hey, we don't have any gasoline, you're going to have to go to the next station, which led to multiple stations having hours-long lines to get gasoline, as you can see over there on the left. That's an actual picture from 1972, in which many people were trying to go to the one or two gas pumps that traditional gas stations had back then. We didn't have the mega ones like we have now with over 50 to 100 pumps that you see out towards I-44. But nonetheless, whenever you go to the gas station, you'd be sitting there waiting for a long time. Some of these people were limited to $3 of gas, or that back then that would have bought you about 6 to 10 gallons of gas, if you can believe that, but they were limited to $3 in the sale. So anyway, Nixon is going to try to help the economy, which is hurting at this point in time because of the price of oil. And so he is going to raise taxes, which is not a very conservative thing to do. Most conservatives seek to cut taxes and cut programs, and he's going to cut the federal budget at the same time. Okay, so he does use that to balance it out. But nonetheless, Congress is going to reject this proposal, so Nixon's going to freeze wages, which means that he is going to say people cannot be paid below a certain amount and they cannot be paid above a certain amount, and he's also going to freeze prices. But the recession is going to continue, and that energy crisis is actually going to continue all the way up through 1981, whenever Jimmy Carter is in office. Okay, he really wanted to be known as a foreign relations president, okay, or a ambassador to the rest of the world and improve our relationship with our traditional enemies. Because of this, and the reason for this, I believe you read this in your textbook, those of you in DCUS history, if you look through there, Nixon did not want to clash with Congress on several issues because Congress was Democratic, he is Republican, so he wants to be seen as a very visible member of the international community. So he is going to heavily rely upon his Secretary, or it's not Secretary of State, sorry, my apologies, but he is going to heavily rely upon his National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger. And Henry Kissinger is going to come up with something called realpolitik. And this is German. Kissinger is actually an immigrant from Germany. He is of Jewish ancestry, but his family came over here. But he is going to practice something called political realism. And Nixon and Henry Kissinger actually rely upon each other so much on international politics, they became known as Nixinger. So anyway, they planned to only deal with countries based on how powerful they were, and they were going to ignore the weaker countries. So basically, they want to go and work with the Soviet Union. They want to go work with China, and this is going to end the policy of containment. Okay, so we're not going to worry about the Vietnams, the Koreas, things like that anymore. If communism spreads, we are not okay with that, but nonetheless, we are not going to try to contain communism anymore. And it did spread to places such as Cambodia during the 1970s, and eventually other presidents will deal with that. But he also is going to seek to find an easing of tensions throughout the world in relation to nuclear conflict and as far as the Cold War goes. This policy was called détente, which means easing of tensions. So he is going to go directly to China. He is going to sit down and meet with China for the first time since they became communists in the 1940s. He also is going to utilize the fact that China and the Soviet Union do not get along at all, and they could become a very powerful alliance. So he basically is going to pit one country against the other as he goes to negotiate with them. As Nixon is in China, he wanted to establish economic and political relationships. Some of those economic relationships last to this day. He's also, like I said, going to pit the Chinese against the Russians, and in doing so, he's going to take information from China to the Soviet Union and help flip that on the Soviet Union. Okay, you can see here in this slide that he is meeting with Leonid Brezhnev of the Soviet Union, who was their premier during the 1970s. But nonetheless, Nixon did go to the Soviet Union and meet with him, becoming the first president since, I believe, Truman to go to the Soviet Union. And he did so 3 months after visiting China. What he went over to the Soviet Union hoping to do is establish a better relationship and also secure a limits on the amount of missiles that they had and the amount of missiles that we had, and seek this peace negotiation that became known as the First Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or the SALT talks. This is known as SALT I. This treaty was guaranteed for 5 years and it was later extended. This is going to be extended later on by President Carter. Now, all these things that I've talked about with Nixon, some people may say, okay, that's not too bad. Conservative aspects they really like. Some people may say, well, this is a rolling back of the policies that we had in the 1960s that brought so much progress. But hey, nonetheless, on the front of foreign relations, things look fairly good. Okay, but his downfall is going to be the fact that Nixon is a little bit paranoid about his image, and he is going to desire a lot of power, and he's going to feel that he cannot be checked on his power. So Nixon's going to practice what they call the imperial presidency. This is where the executive branch becomes the most powerful branch by far, utilizes the other two branches to pit against each other, and he's fully going to believe that the president should be supreme and have unlimited power. He is famous for saying, if the president does it, that means it's not illegal. Okay, so, which as we know, the president can be checked by both the Supreme Court and by Congress. Now, a lot of Nixon's paranoia comes from the fact that he wants to make sure that he gets elected again in 1972, and he's a two-term president. So, on June 17th, 1972, there is going to be a group of individuals who will come to find out later on are connected to Nixon, but a group of individuals that are going to look to help get Nixon reelected. They want to know what the Democratic strategies are in 1972, because they fear that a Democrat could step in and possibly take the White House, because after all, Congress at this point in time is Democratic. But on June 17th, 1972 at 2:30 a.m. at the Watergate Hotel and Office Complex in Washington, D.C., there were 5 men who were caught by a security guard there breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters. This is where basically a lot of the Democratic strategy and lawyers and propaganda was generated for the 1972 election that was coming up in November, and they were going to see what the strategy of a guy named George McGovern was going to be within the election. The idea was to put wiretaps on the phones so that way they could hear the calls going in and out, possibly take pictures of documents, and get these back to the committee to reelect the president, so that way they would have an easier time in plotting how to win states from McGovern. Okay, one of the men who broke into the office is going to be the security coordinator for that organization. So there's going to be a link there later on, okay, with evidence. Okay, now, whenever these men are found breaking into that office, they're going to be arrested. And after they are arrested, the committee to reelect the president is going to have a fund that's going to pay the burglars about $450,000 to buy their silence about why they broke in. And the goal with this was to make sure that there was no connection back to the president. But as you may know already, they're going to find connections back to Nixon. Okay, the election of 1972, as you can see right here, that was pretty handily won by Richard Nixon. Okay, this is going to be the largest electoral vote win in history up to that point in time. The only unanimous election that was going to take place was going to be, of course, George Washington's 2 elections. But as you can see here, with Massachusetts only going to McGovern, as well as the 3 electoral votes of Washington, D.C., as well as a small district in Western Virginia going to the Libertarian candidate, Nixon had a very handy win in this election. So in the election of 1972, Nixon carries 49 out of 50 states. Again, the largest electoral victory in history up to that point in time, which will be surpassed by Ronald Reagan. But nonetheless, this is going to be seen as kind of like the high point for Nixon's presidency. However, the Watergate scandal is going to continue to build throughout the rest of 1972 and all of 1973 into 1974. So Nixon's presidency is going to begin to unravel as a result of one of the burglars that was at Watergate sending a letter to a judge that heard his case and that letter is going to say, hey, I've been lying about why we broke in, I've been lying about the involvement, and I can actually connect the president to this crime and break-in. Okay, well, this is a bombshell, and this is going to be a very political, bring a lot of political turmoil upon Richard Nixon. So the Senate's going to launch a formal investigation of the Watergate break-in. There's going to be testimony before the Senate that's going to basically say that Nixon himself is going to be responsible for discussing ways to cover up the investigation. He doesn't want it tied back to his election committee or the White House, and he is going to basically take drastic steps to make sure that his tracks are covered. Nixon is also going to be found to have recorded all of his Oval Office conversations. And while there could be a lot of evidence on there to convict the president, he says that those are privileged information that he is using for his memoirs, and he's going to refuse to turn the tapes over. Okay, and several of these tapes, whenever they later come out, there's going to be parts of them missing, and there's going to be parts of them whenever he releases the transcripts that have a lot of deleted sections within them, and they call this basically the smoking gun that could help convict Nixon. The battle for the tapes. So, as you know, there could be a legal process in order to see that the tapes are turned over to the prosecutors appointed to see this Watergate case. So, with the battle for the tapes, there's going to be a year-long battle within the Supreme Court and other various courts throughout the United States in which the special prosecutor that was appointed to oversee the Watergate case, a guy named Archibald Cox, who is going to investigate this case, is going to sue for them. Nixon is going to look to his attorney general, who actually oversees Archibald Cox, who's investigating this, and he's going to tell his attorney general, Elliot Richardson, to fire Archibald Cox. So that way the investigation will cease, and that way the Watergate scandal in Nixon's eyes could go away. Richardson refused to do this, and he actually winds up resigning because he refused to fire Archibald Cox to further cover up this investigation. Okay, so whenever he resigns, his deputy, so the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, is going to be ordered to fire Archibald Cox, and he's going to refuse. He's going to be fired by Nixon. Okay, the next person in line is going to come in to the White House, and Nixon's going to say, okay, the Attorney General has resigned. I have fired the Deputy Attorney General. Here's what I need out of you. That guy is going to be the one that actually fires Archibald Cox. This whole incident is going to become known as the Saturday Night Massacre, in which basically the entire Justice Department was turned on its head, and the top individuals in the Justice Department are going to be taken out. Okay, so this is going to be seen as another major red flag in terms of how is Nixon connected to Watergate. Okay, keep in mind they don't know all this stuff that I've been kind of hinting at as we go along here. By March of 1974, 7 of Nixon's aides are going to be indicted and charged with obstruction of justice and perjury. Okay, which basically means that they are going to be brought up on charges from Congress that say, you're about to testify, you lied to us, or you refused to testify, so now we are going to prosecute you for lying under oath. And we are going to find out why there's such a big cover-up with Watergate. So Nixon realizes that the heat is on him and things are not looking good. There's talk of possible impeachments and things of that sort. So he is going to decide, I'm not going to release the tapes that have all my conversations from the White House on them, but I will release typed up transcripts of these tapes. Okay, and these transcripts were released. You can see Nixon here talking about everything. He had nothing to hide, I believe, as part of the speech. But he is going to say, I have all the transcripts here. If you want to know who all I was talking to, they are in here. all the dates, all the things that were said. However, there's going to be, as people start looking through these transcripts, they're going to see several blacked out sections say expletive deleted. And people ask Nixon about this, and he says, well, I don't want people to know that I swear. Or I don't want people to know that this individual who people hold in high regard, he was swearing as well. So anyway, investigators are going to continue to sue for the real tapes all the way to the Supreme Court, who rules on July 24th, 1974, that the president must release the tapes. Okay, so the president is going to drag his feet on this for a couple of days, and as he's dragging his feet on releasing the tapes, the House, or a House committee, is going to vote to impeach Nixon. So they're going to have a full House vote to impeach Nixon and have a trial in which they're going to accuse him of high crimes and misdemeanors, in which he could be removed from office as a result of this scandal. Okay, so they said he was obstructing justice, abusing his power, and was in contempt of Congress for ignoring these orders. So Nixon, seeing that he possibly is going to be impeached, is going to decide to release the tapes on August 5th, 1974. However, one tape, which becomes known, like I said, as the smoking gun tape, is going to have 18 minutes and 30 seconds missing off of the tape in which he was meeting with a very critical individual in the Watergate investigation. Supposedly, the story was the president's secretary had accidentally erased it as she was cleaning out her office. Okay. However, the tapes also, with the expletive deleted sections, they are going to reveal undeniable evidence that Nixon had taken steps to impede the investigation with the break-in. Okay. On August the 8th of 1974, 3 days after this, Nixon's going to feel the heat coming on him. He knows that he is he's facing impeachment. He does not want to be the only president at that point in time that has ever been impeached and removed from office. So he is going to resign as president, and he's going to avoid facing impeachment by Congress as a result of his resignation. Later on that day at noon, Gerald R. Ford, who actually, interesting backstory here, who is the vice president, but had been appointed to the vice presidency after Spiro Agnew, the original vice president of Nixon, was forced to resign for as part of a plea bargain in a tax evasion case that he had. So Ford actually had not been the vice president on the ticket in 1972, had been appointed as the vice president, and then now all of a sudden is taking office. Okay, so nonetheless, Gerald R. Ford is going to become the next president after Richard Nixon. He is going to be in office from 1974 to 1976. We'll talk about that here in just a bit. But 25 people who are going to work for Nixon are going to serve time in prison for their involvement in the Watergate scandal. So that is going to conclude that section on the 1970s. This is incorrect right here on the 1980s. This is going to be 1975. I apologize for this. It's going to be 1974, 1975 to 1981. Okay, now, Gerald R. Ford is president. He is 1 month after he is going to take office. He is going to pardon Richard Nixon for any crimes that he may have committed. Ford realized that a former president being in prison for his involvement in a scandal is not going to look good for the Americans with our foreign enemies. China will seize on it as well as the Soviet Union. He doesn't want this, so he's going to issue a full pardon for anything that Richard Nixon did involving Watergate. Immediately, the public is going to turn on Gerald R. Ford. Okay, he was seen as a great healer and restoring faith in the office of the president, acting the way a president should. However, he is not going to be the most popular man for the office at this point in time. After all, he was not elected to the position and had not even been on the ticket for the position. So, as he takes office, the Watergate scandal is swirling. He is a Republican. People are losing faith in Republicans. And he's also going to face a very bad economy in which inflation is going to plague Ford throughout the rest of his term. Blame was placed on the high price of oil because of OPEC also raising the price of oil. As you saw earlier, there's going to be a further energy crisis throughout the 1970s. It's going to continue into Ford and later Carter's terms as president. But he also is going to be unpopular because he refused to take action in Vietnam after the North overtook the South, and he said we must never intervene again. Okay. However, probably the greatest success, and I'll argue another success here in just a second, but the greatest success that comes out of Ford's presidency is going to probably be his wife. His wife is going to be very open about the fact that while she is in the White House, she actually develops breast cancer, and she's very open about her surgeries to cure that breast cancer and about women's health in general. And she also is going to be very open about the fact that she had addictions to painkillers and alcohol, and is going to go through rehab and be very open about the fact that people need to be more willing to seek help for their addictions. And she's going to establish the Betty Ford Center, or the Betty Ford Clinic, for drug and alcohol rehab, and is going to, it's still utilized very heavily by some very famous people, as a matter of fact, for them to go get off of these substances and say, hey, it's not just the lower classes of society that have issues with this. It can go all the way to the White House, in which you have somebody that's there with these addictions. So she's actually a more popular individual than Gerald R. Ford is. But nonetheless, Gerald R. Ford's probably greatest accomplishment as president, as you may have looked through the book from Eric Foner, those of you in DCUS history, that could be one of several different things that I would take an answer on. One was healing the nation. Two was the fact that he was able to secure a little bit better relationship with the Soviet Union. But nonetheless, he is not going to be reelected in 1976. As he runs, he is going to go up against a newcomer, the Georgia governor, a guy named Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter is going to be a peanut farmer, kind of seen as a down-to-earth, very honest guy, very religious guy, still teaches, as of 2022, still teaches Sunday school on a regular basis at his church down in near Atlanta. But many people are going to vote for him because he is going to be an outsider from the traditional Washington politicians. So as Carter takes office, he is going to be seen as very frugal. He wants to make sure that everybody feels the effects of the stagnant economy that they are facing at that point in time. Going to cut certain things out of the White House and make it seen as the president, is just another normal, everyday guy. So one thing that he is very notorious for doing is, the president, you very rarely see them carrying anything like a briefcase or a suitcase or anything like that. Carter's going to make it a point to go and take his suitcases and take them on and off of Air Force One and show that he is not an imperial president. Okay, he does inherit that energy crisis, which actually is going to grow at this point in time with long lines for gas, high oil prices, and economic inflation. Basically, the bad economy is going to doom Carter in his one term as president from 1978 to 1977 to 1981, going to leave office in 1981. His greatest success, however, is going to be the fact that he actually gets a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel in the Camp David Accords. And again, you saw the result of us backing Israel in this war that they fought against Egypt and other nations. And there's going to be 12 days of negotiations at Camp David that become known as Camp David Accords. This peace agreement is seen and achieved, and this is going to basically help Jimmy Carter have a little bit better image in the public, but people are still upset about the economy. So the other thing that's going to help doom Jimmy Carter's one term as president is the fact that a very key ally in the Middle East of ours, in Iran, is going to have a revolution in which Islamic individuals are going to take over that nation and going to form a theocracy. That group of individuals is headed by a guy named Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Ayatollah Khomeini, who you see down here on the bottom right-hand part of the screen, was known as probably the top, not the top, in the 1980s was known as probably the top enemy of the United States, maybe more so than the Soviet Union. Okay, basically seen as a thorn in the side of President Reagan. But nonetheless, Ayatollah Khomeini is going to lead a revolution in Iran. They're going to establish a theocracy in which the Islamic law is going to be the rule of the land. And every law that they have is going to be based upon this. Many people fear a loss of rights for people such as women, and many people are going to flee Iran. They do overthrow the Shah of Iran, who is basically the king of Iran, who is our key ally, like I said, in the Middle East, and they want to actually get a hold of him and execute him. Well, Carter is going to allow the Shah to come to the U.S. for cancer treatments. This really angers the rebels in Iran, and they see us now as an enemy. They can still consider us an enemy to this day, okay? And they actually are trying to start up a nuclear program to deter us from ever invading them. So they're going to seize our embassy in Iran, and they're going to take 52 Americans hostage while they're there. And you can see that depicted on the bottom left-hand side. As these people are held in captivity, they were fed, they were allowed certain communication with the outside world, they were allowed to hear various sports games. I believe they gave him a copy of the Super Bowl to listen to at one point in time. But these people are going to be kept hostage there for 444 days. This included the Marine Guards and the workers at the embassy. They eventually are going to be released on January 20th, 1981, which is the day that Carter left office. Basically, because Carter let the Shah of Iran into the United States, the second that he leaves office, these hostages are going to be freed, mostly to be seen as kind of like one last forget you, for lack of better terms, to or from Iran to the United States. Okay, so once President Reagan takes office, these hostages are going to be released. However, it is interesting to know that on Inauguration Day, as Carter has lost the election in 1980, he had worked all the way up from, I believe, he was up for 2 days. It was something like 54 hours that he was up trying to negotiate an end to this hostage crisis. And basically, Iran was not willing to budge until Carter had actually left office. So those hostages are released on January 20th, 1981. And that is seen as a very high note to begin the Reagan presidency upon. So we will actually talk about Ronald Reagan next week.